Welcome to this episode of 10 Minutes with Sam, and this is Akshat Singh. Our guest today is Mr. Shivshankar Menon, a former diplomat who has served as the Foreign Secretary as well as the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India. Our conversation today is part of a series on former Prime Minister PV Narasimha Rao's life. And for the first video in the series, please check our description. Welcome to the show, sir. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's good of you to ask me.
So the format of the show is fairly simple. We have 10 minutes and we try to cover as much ground as we can in these 10 minutes. Since you are an expert on international relations and foreign policy, our questions would be in that domain. So without wasting much time, let's get to the first question. So Indo-China relations currently are a hot button issue. Could you tell us a little about the role that former Prime Minister PV Narasimha Rao played in developing Indo-China relations?
Well, he was pivotal to actually shifting our relationship to a much more stable basis. He was foreign minister when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China in 1988, when we came to a basic understanding of how to develop the relationship. And then when he himself became prime minister and the world changed, it was the end of the Cold War, Soviet Union had collapsed, and we were going through an economic crisis. He opened up our economy. He was transforming our relationship with the US. He realized and felt very strongly that we didn't need to have trouble with the Chinese, that we needed to pacify and calm that relationship down. And so it was really under his watch and with his guidance that we negotiated the first border-related agreement that we did with China in '93 on the maintenance of peace and tranquility along in the border, on the basis that both countries would respect the status quo. The line of actual control, where we didn't agree about it, we would then both seek to clarify it, but that we wouldn't change the status quo. We would discuss our differences, and this is actually, and that was a basis which worked. It helped to develop the relationship, made it much more predictable. We opened up trade, travel. China became our biggest trading partner. And we cooperated in WTO, climate change negotiations, various places where we had common interests. And we kept discussing our differences and narrowed them down. So many of them, like, for instance, Chinese support to Indian insurgents in the Northeast, that dried up. There were a whole series of things that we did because the Chinese had the same interest at that time. They also had other things to worry about. They'd just gone through Tiananmen at home, so they had a domestic crisis in '89. They also were worried that they were next in the list of regime change of communist regimes. Soviet Union had collapsed. This was the unipolar moment where the US was the superpower, the sole superpower. So they didn't want, and they were concentrating on their own reform and strengthening themselves. So they also wanted, so it suited both sides. And that's really how the peace was maintained on the border, thanks to what he helped us to do. But what I really learned from him, because I was the joint secretary negotiating the agreement, and when we started negotiating with the Chinese, he told me, go and talk to the following 6 people. And most of them were in the opposition leaders, were Mr. Vajpayee, Advani, and Gujral, and so on. And so I said, well, what am I going to them for? He said, just go and ask them what you should do. And tell them that you're negotiating, and ask them for their advice, and go back to them every month and talk to them. And so I did. And the result was that, frankly, A, I got good ideas, but B, when we were negotiating with the Chinese, it was India negotiating. And when we finally signed the agreement, there was not a squeak of protest. Everybody supported it because they'd been part of the process.
Absolutely, sir. This is very fascinating because of this one thing that you mentioned about you approaching the opposition leaders. And that's very fascinating because we usually have this idea that Indian political parties do not have a distinct foreign policy. And we don't even realize that this facet of agreement on large foreign policy issues, it's not natural. There is a lot of work that goes on to building that coalition on foreign policy issues, and that's very, very fascinating. So you were also instrumental in working with PM PV Narasimha Rao when it came to establishing Indo-Israel relations. That was a particularly tumultuous.
Well, actually, other people did the hard work. He sent me as the second ambassador to Israel. I mean, we opened the relationship in '92. We opened the diplomatic relationship. We had recognized Israel much earlier, I mean, in the early 50s, in 50. But we didn't have an embassy there. And it was a masterclass in how to do this, because he invited Yasser Arafat here. And it was Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian, who said, you should have an embassy in Israel to tell the Israelis the truth. And said so in public in a press conference in India. So that sort of neutralized whatever opposition there would have been, you know, in India. And it stopped it from becoming a party political issue. And having done that, then PK Singh was the first ambassador, and I was the second. So I was the lucky one, actually. PK Singh did all the hard work of setting things up. And I went there when it was a time of hope also. And the Middle East peace process was working, you know, after the Oslo Accords. Rabin was prime minister. He was assassinated while I was there. And by the time I left, 2.5 years later, of course, things were very different. The Israelis were fighting a war in Lebanon. Netanyahu had become prime minister for the first time. But frankly, the relationship between us and the Israelis, that was blooming. I mean, in agriculture, in defense, in education, in a whole host of things, water management, you name it. And then I told him very proudly, oh, you know, we can get this drip irrigation technology and, you know, I can get it free. And he said, no, whatever you do, don't give it to anybody free because they won't value it. They won't use it. And he was so right. The states which actually paid for it and invested in it are the ones which are using it the most today, Maharashtra and so on. States where it came as a grant or as assistance, as aid, free, it's vanished.
That's a very interesting point, sir. So one question about the Indo-Israel relationship at that point. So we saw this was in '92. This was right after the liberalization period for India. So what role do you think that India's posturing towards the US post-liberalization had to play in our relationship with Israel?
I think it worked both ways. I mean, it was mutually reinforcing. I think the US found it very reassuring that we had now established an embassy in Israel and that we were working together with them. Just 2 years later, we also established an office in Taiwan, for instance. But equally, I think the Israelis also saw that we were reworking our relationship with the US and across the board. But don't forget, this was a time where we were rebuilding, actually recasting our foreign policy in a very fundamental way. What Narasimha Rao did was to, as I said, stabilize the relationship with China, take it off the conflict track, and actually make it a predictable relationship. Maybe not a wonderful relationship, but certainly a predictable relationship. He transformed the relationship with the US. He rebuilt a relationship with Russia, which was at that stage going through all kinds of convulsions, where he also started up a relationship with Europe. And if you think of it, he was careful, and most importantly, he started Look East. In April '92, he came to Japan, and for the first time, he spoke of a Look East policy, which included ASEAN, which brought us back into Southeast Asia, East Asia, and built up the relationship that we now enjoy with Japan. It's a result of years of hard work. But all these we can trace back to what he did.
Absolutely, sir. So this brings us to the end of 10 minutes. Thank you for speaking with us. And it was absolutely wonderful knowing the aspects of foreign policy that PV Narasimha Rao worked on. Once again, thank you very much. And we'll have you very soon again. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much.